You are deeply asleep in your bed, buried under layers of heavy blankets to ward off the biting chill of a Chicago winter. The date is November 14, 1990, and outside, a fierce wind is whipping against the brick walls of your home, creating a constant, howling drone. You feel completely safe in your sanctuary, the warmth of the indoors contrasting sharply with the freezing temperature on the other side of the glass. Suddenly, your eyes snap open, not because of a nightmare, but because of a sound that cuts through the white noise of the storm. It is the distinct, unmistakable creak of the floorboard right outside your bedroom door. You hold your breath, your heart beginning to pound against your ribs, listening intently. Then, you hear it again, a soft, wet squelch, like a damp boot pressing into the carpet, just inches away from where you lay vulnerable in the dark. Before we unravel the terrifying sequence of events that destroyed a family's sense of safety, I have a small request. If you appreciate true crime stories that delve deep into the mystery and psychology of the unknown, please take a second to hit the like button. It helps these stories reach more people and supports the channel in a meaningful way. Now, let's travel back to the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago in 1990, a place where historic architecture met old money, and where residents believed that their heavy oak doors and iron gates were enough to keep the city's rising crime rate at bay. The focal point of our story is the Bennett family, who lived in a sprawling, three-story brownstone on Elm Street. To the outside world, they were the picture-perfect example of upper-middle-class success. Thomas Bennett, 42, was a high-powered corporate litigator known for his sharp mind and intimidating presence in the courtroom. His wife, Eleanor, 39, was a pediatric nurse whose warmth and kindness made her a pillar of the local community. Together, they were raising two children, 10-year-old Jason, a quiet boy who loved chess, and 7-year-old Sarah, a bundle of energy obsessed with ballet. Their home was their fortress, a beautifully renovated property that had stood for nearly a century, filled with antiques and the comfortable clutter of a happy family life. The layout of the Bennett residence is crucial to understanding how the nightmare unfolded. The ground floor consisted of a grand foyer, a formal living room, a dining area, and a large kitchen at the back that opened into a small, enclosed courtyard. The second floor housed the master suite, which was situated at the rear of the house overlooking the courtyard, while the children's bedrooms were located down a long hallway toward the front of the street. Between the parents' room and the kids' rooms was a spacious bathroom and a staircase leading up to an attic used for storage. This separation meant that while the children were sleeping near the streetlights, Thomas and Eleanor were tucked away in the back, isolated by the length of the hallway and the heavy doors of the old house. On the evening of November 14th, the atmosphere in Chicago was ominous. The weather forecast had predicted a severe drop in temperature, and by late afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised purple, signaling an incoming storm. The Bennetts had returned home around 6:00 p.m., rushing inside to escape the biting wind. Neighbors would later recall seeing the lights of the Bennett house glowing warmly against the dark street, a scene of domestic tranquility. Inside, the family went about their evening routine. Thomas was in the study reviewing case files. Eleanor was preparing a hearty stew for dinner, and the children were finishing their homework at the kitchen table. "Make sure you finish that math worksheet before dinner, Jason," Eleanor called out from the stove, her voice mixing with the bubbling sounds of the pot. By 7:30 p.m., the family gathered in the dining room. The wind outside had picked up significantly, rattling the window frames and causing the old house to groan and settle. Despite the noise outside, the mood at the table was light. They discussed plans for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday, debating whether to host extended family or travel to Eleanor's parents in Wisconsin. "I think we should stay here this year," Thomas suggested, carving a slice of bread. "The house is finally ready for guests, and I don't want to drive in this weather." It was a mundane conversation, the kind that happens in millions of homes every night, completely oblivious to the fact that their movements were being watched from the shadows of the alleyway behind their home. After dinner, the family moved to the living room to watch a bit of television before bed. Their golden retriever, Buster, usually a lazy and affectionate dog, began acting strangely around 9:00 p.m. He paced back and forth in front of the back door in the kitchen, whining low in his throat and staring at the locked handle. Thomas noticed the behavior and walked into the kitchen to check. "What is it?" "Boy, is there a stray cat out there?" Thomas asked, peering through the small window in the door. All he could see was the swirling snow and the dark outline of the courtyard walls. He double-checked the deadbolt, rattled the handle to ensure it was secure, and patted the dog's head. "It's nothing, Buster. Just the wind." At 1:00 p.m., the children were sent upstairs to get ready for bed. Eleanor followed shortly after to read them a story, leaving Thomas downstairs to do his final rounds. He was a creature of habit, meticulous about security. He checked the front door locks, ensured the windows in the living room were latched, and turned off all the downstairs lights. The house plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the street lamps filtering through the front drapes. As he walked up the stairs, the wooden steps creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that usually signaled safety and the end of the day. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last time he would perform this routine in peace. By 1:00 p.m., the entire house was asleep. Thomas and Eleanor lay in their master's suite at the back of the house. The heavy oak door closed, but not locked. Down the hall, Jason and Sarah were sound asleep in their respective rooms. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling like a banshee, masking any subtle noises that might have come from the ground floor. The house settled into a deep winter slumber. Hours passed in darkness, but then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., the silence of the master bedroom was broken not by the wind, but by the slow, deliberate turn of the doorknob. Thomas blinked rapidly in the darkness, his mind struggling to transition from the fog of sleep to the sharp reality of the moment. The brass doorknob of the master bedroom was not just glinting in the faint light, it was physically rotating, turning slowly to the right with a grinding metallic friction that seemed deafening in the silence. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, as his eyes locked onto the movement. "Jason, is that you?" Thomas whispered harshly, assuming one of the children had had a nightmare and was coming to seek comfort. The rotation stopped instantly. The knob did not turn back, nor did the door open. It simply held there, suspended in a state of tension, as if the person on the other side was holding their breath, just as Thomas was. Beside him, Eleanor stirred, sensing the sudden rigidity in her husband's body. She propped herself up on one elbow, squinting into the gloom, her voice thick with sleep. "Tom, what's wrong? Did you hear something?" Thomas reached out a hand to silence her, his eyes never leaving the door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribcage. "Shh, someone is at the door. I think it's one of the kids. But they stopped trying to open it," he murmured, sliding his legs out from under the warm duvet. The air in the room felt colder than usual, a draft seeping under the doorframe that chilled his bare feet instantly. He grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight he kept on the nightstand, using it more as a potential weapon than a light source. Thomas approached the door with deliberate slowness, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to grasp the knob. He ripped the door open in one fluid motion, flooding the hallway with the beam of his flashlight, expecting to see a frightened child in pajamas. But the hallway was empty. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the patterned runner rug and the family portraits on the walls. But there was no one there. "Jason, Sarah," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the stairwell. The silence that answered him was heavy and oppressive. He stepped out into the hall, looking left toward the children's rooms and right toward the stairs, trying to make sense of the vanishing act. He moved quickly to the children's bedrooms, a fear beginning to coil tightly in his stomach. He pushed open Jason's door first. The boy was sound asleep, tangled in his sheets, breathing rhythmically. He checked Sarah's room next. She was curled up with her teddy bear, completely undisturbed. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a cold dread. If the children were asleep, who had turned the knob? Thomas stood in the center of the hallway, the flashlight beam wavering slightly. That was when he noticed the temperature. It wasn't just a draft, the house was freezing, far colder than the thermostat setting should allow. The cold air seemed to be rising from the floor below, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and ozone. "Tom, is everything okay?" Eleanor's voice called out from the bedroom, laced with rising panic. Thomas turned back, whispering loudly, "Stay in the room. Elle, lock the door. I'm going to check downstairs. I think I left a window open or something." He lied to protect her from the immediate fear, but his mind was racing through terrifying possibilities. He began to descend the main staircase, the wood creaking loudly under his feet. He swept the flashlight beam across the living room below, the shadows stretching and contorting into grotesque shapes. Why hadn't Buster barked? The dog was a light sleeper and usually alerted them to the mailman, let alone an intruder walking through the house. Reaching the ground floor, the chill was intense, biting through his thin pajamas. He walked into the foyer, checking the front door. The deadbolt was still engaged, the chain secure. He moved to the living room. The windows were locked tight. Confused, he turned toward the kitchen at the back of the house, and that's where the smell hit him, the distinct, metallic scent of the outdoors mixed with something foul, like stagnant water. He pushed the swinging door to the kitchen open and froze. The back door, the one he had double-checked just hours ago, was standing wide open, swaying slightly in the violent wind. Snow was drifting onto the kitchen linoleum, forming a white dusting over a series of muddy puddles. Thomas rushed to the door and slammed it shut, engaging the lock with shaking hands. He examined the frame and felt his stomach drop. The wood around the strike plate was splintered. The door hadn't been picked. It had been kicked in or forced with a crowbar, but done with such precision or during a gust of wind that the noise had been masked. He shined his light on the floor, tracing the path of the intruder. A trail of heavy, muddy boot prints led from the door into the kitchen, but they didn't just stop there. They meandered. The intruder hadn't just broken in. They had been walking around the ground floor, perhaps for quite some time. While the family slept upstairs, he remembered the dog and swung the light toward the corner where Buster's bed was located. The bed was empty. "Buster," he hissed into the dark kitchen, praying for the familiar click of claws on the floor. There was no sound. He walked over to the wall phone to call the police, his fingers fumbling with the receiver. He lifted it to his ear, expecting the dial tone, but was met with a dead, hollow silence. He tapped the receiver hook frantically. Nothing. The line was dead. Panic flared, hot and bright. This wasn't a random burglary. This was calculated. The phone lines had been cut from the outside before the entry was made. Thomas knew he had to get back to his family immediately. He turned to leave the kitchen, his flashlight beam sweeping across the pantry door. He stopped. There, on the white paint of the pantry door frame, was a smear of something dark. He stepped closer, inspecting it. It wasn't mud. It was red, viscous, and fresh. Blood. His mind reeled, trying to connect the dots between the open door, the missing dog, and the blood. A sudden noise from the floor above a heavy fluke, dragging sound directly over his head, snapped him back to reality. The intruder wasn't gone. They weren't downstairs. They had circled back and were already on the second floor. He sprinted for the stairs, abandoning all caution, his bare feet slapping against the hardwood. "Eleanor, lock the door," he screamed, his voice tearing through the silence of the house. He took the stairs two at a time, the flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of him. As he reached the landing, he looked down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. The door he had told Eleanor to lock was standing slightly ajar, and standing right in front of it, silhouetted by the faint light from within the room, was a tall, dark figure wearing a heavy trench coat, motionless, staring directly at Thomas. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, time seemed to suspend itself in the hallway of the Bennett home. Thomas stood at the top of the stairs, his chest heaving, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand as it illuminated the intruder. The figure was immense, clad in a heavy, dark canvas coat that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A woolen ski mask obscured his face, leaving only two dark, hollow voids where eyes should be, staring back with a chilling lack of emotion. The stranger didn't flinch, didn't run, and didn't speak. He simply stood there, blocking the path to Eleanor, radiating a calm, predatory malice that was far more terrifying than any verbal threat. Adrenaline flooded Thomas's system, overriding the paralysis of fear with a primal need to protect his wife. He let out a guttural roar, swinging the heavy maglite like a club as he charged down the few remaining feet of the hallway. "Get away from her, Eleanor. Lock the door," Thomas screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. He swung the metal flashlight with all his might, aiming for the intruder's head, hoping to incapacitate him in one strike. But the stranger moved with unnatural speed, raising a gloved forearm to block the blow. The sickening crack of metal hitting bone echoed through the house. But the intruder didn't even grunt in pain. Instead of recoiling, the intruder stepped forward, using his size to overwhelm Thomas. He grabbed Thomas by the throat with a hand that felt like a steel vise, lifting him off his feet and slamming him violently against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of Thomas, and the flashlight clattered to the floor, rolling away and casting dizzying, strobe-like shadows across the ceiling. "Who are you? What do you want?" Thomas gasped, clawing uselessly at the leather glove, crushing his windpipe. The man didn't answer. He just tightened his grip, tilting his head slightly to the side as if observing an insect struggling on a pin. Inside the bedroom, Eleanor heard the violent thud of bodies hitting the wall and the sounds of her husband choking. Panic seized her, but she knew she couldn't just hide. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the bedside table, ripping the cord from the wall. "I'm calling the police. I have a gun," she lied, screaming at the top of her lungs, hoping to bluff the attacker into fleeing. She flung the bedroom door wide open, raising the lamp to strike. The sight that met her stopped her cold. Her husband was sliding down the wall, his face turning purple, held in place by a monster of a man who seemed completely unbothered by her presence. The intruder casually tossed Thomas aside like a rag doll, letting him crumple to the floor, gasping for air. The man then turned his attention slowly toward Eleanor. He didn't rush at her. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate gait, stepping over Thomas's writhing body. Eleanor swung the lamp with desperation, shattering the bulb against the man's shoulder. But it was like hitting a tree trunk. He caught her wrist mid-swing, twisting it painfully until she dropped the improvised weapon. He didn't strike her. He just loomed over her, forcing her back into the bedroom, backing her toward the corner of the room where there was no escape. Thomas, fighting through the gray fog, threatening to knock him unconscious, forced himself to his hands and knees. He could hear Eleanor sobbing and the heavy, wet footsteps of the man moving inside the bedroom. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "Don't touch her. Take whatever you want," Thomas wheezed, crawling steadily toward the doorway. He expected the sounds of ransacking drawers being pulled, jewelry boxes being dumped, but there was only silence. The intruder wasn't stealing anything. He was just standing there, watching Eleanor cower, deriving some sick satisfaction from the terror he was inflicting. Suddenly, a small, high-pitched voice cut through the tension from the other end of the hallway. "Daddy, Mommy." It was 10-year-old Jason, standing in the doorway of his room, rubbing his eyes, confused by the noise. The intruder's head snapped toward the sound of the child. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The predator had found new prey. The man turned away from Eleanor and began to walk back out into the hallway, moving toward the boy. Thomas saw the shift in focus and felt a surge of horror that eclipsed everything else. He knew he had to stop this man before he reached the children, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. Thomas lunged forward, tackling the intruder around the ankles just as he stepped into the hall. The surprise attack worked. The large man stumbled, crashing heavily to the floor with a grunt of annoyance. Thomas scrambled onto the man's back, locking his arms around the intruder's neck in a desperate chokehold. "Run. Jason, get Sarah and hide in the closet," now Thomas bellowed, tightening his grip even as the intruder began to thrash wildly. The man was immensely strong, bucking and twisting, slamming Thomas against the doorframe in an attempt to dislodge him. Jason, terrified by the sight of his father fighting a masked giant, didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his sister's arm as she emerged sleepily from her room and dragged her into the linen closet, locking the door from the inside. Meanwhile, the struggle in the hallway reached a fever pitch. The intruder managed to roll over, pinning Thomas beneath his massive weight. He rained down 2 brutal punches to Thomas's face, the heavy leather gloves tearing skin and shattering cartilage. Thomas's vision went black for a second, his grip loosening. The fight was over. He lay there, helpless, waiting for the final blow that would end his life. But the blow never came. The intruder stood up, breathing heavily, adjusting his coat. He looked down at Thomas, then toward the locked closet door where the children were hiding, and finally back at Eleanor, who was now standing in the bedroom doorway holding a pair of scissors. For a moment, he seemed to be calculating his next move. Then, the sound of a distant siren began to wail, growing louder with each second. A neighbor, awakened by the screams, must have called 911. The intruder paused, tilting his head to listen. Without a word, he turned and sprinted toward the back stairs, moving with the agility of a much younger man. Thomas lay on the floor, blood pouring from his nose and a gash above his eye, listening to the heavy footsteps retreating down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door. The cold wind rushed back into the house, slamming the door shut with a finality that echoed through the silence. "Is he gone, Tom? Is he gone?" Eleanor cried, crawling over to her husband, her hand shaking so badly she could barely touch his face. Thomas coughed, spitting blood onto the carpet, and nodded weakly. Check the kids," he whispered, darkness finally overtaking him as he succumbed to his injuries. The sound of the sirens, now wailing directly outside their front door. The immediate aftermath of the attack was a blur of chaotic red and blue lights flashing against the snow-covered trees of Elm Street. Paramedics rushed Thomas out of the house on a stretcher, an oxygen mask pressed to his face as he drifted in and out of consciousness, while police officers swarmed the property with guns drawn. Eleanor sat on the bumper of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, clutching Jason and Sarah so tightly her knuckles were white. He was so big, he just wouldn't stop. She stammered to a female officer, her voice trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline crash set in. The children were silent, their eyes wide and unblinking, traumatized by the violence they had witnessed in their own hallway. The sanctuary of their home had been violated in the most brutal way possible, transforming their safe haven into a crime scene marked by yellow tape and the heavy boots of strangers. Detectives Miller and Kowalski were assigned to the case, and they immediately began to process the scene, hoping to catch the perpetrator before the trail went cold in the snow. They started at the point of entry in the kitchen, noting the splintered wood of the back door frame. This wasn't a finesse job, but it was calculated, Miller observed, shining his flashlight on the severed phone line dangling outside the window. The intruder had cut the communication before making his move, proving premeditation. They followed the muddy boot prints that Thomas had seen, tracking them through the kitchen and into the living room. However, the tracks didn't just lead to the stairs. They circled the entire ground floor, pausing at family photos and lingering near the coat rack, suggesting the intruder had taken his time to absorb the essence of the family before attacking. As the officers expanded their search to the exterior of the property, a grim discovery was made in the corner of the courtyard. Officer Kowalski found Buster, the family's golden retriever, lying motionless behind a stack of firewood. The dog hadn't been killed violently. Instead, there was a piece of raw meat lying near his snout, laced with a powerful sedative. He drugged the dog, Kowalski muttered, kneeling to check the animal, who was breathing shallowly but would thankfully survive. This detail sent a chill down the detectives' spines. It meant the attacker had come prepared with specific knowledge of the family's pet, likely having watched them long enough to know the dog's habits. This wasn't a random drifter looking for a quick score. This was a hunter who had neutralized the alarm system before stepping foot inside. Back inside, the crime scene technicians were dusting for fingerprints, but their efforts were yielding nothing but frustration. The intruder had worn heavy leather gloves, leaving behind no ridge detail, only smudges on the door frames and the banister. They collected samples of the mud from the boot prints, hoping the soil composition might point to a specific location. But early indications suggested it was just common Chicago topsoil mixed with road salt. The only physical evidence they had was the blood on the pantry door frame. But it turned out to be Thomas's blood, likely transferred during the struggle. The intruder had been a ghost, a massive, violent shadow that had materialized, wreaked havoc, and vanished without leaving a trace of his own identity. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation, however, was the motive, or rather, the complete lack of one. As Eleanor walked through the house with the detectives later that morning to identify what was missing, the confusion grew. The silverware was untouched. Thomas's wallet, which had been sitting on the dresser, was still full of cash. Eleanor's jewelry box in the bedroom was open, but nothing had been taken. "He didn't want our things," Eleanor whispered, a horrifying realization dawning on her as she looked at the bruised throat of her husband in the hospital photos. "He wanted us." The police realized they weren't dealing with a burglary gone wrong. They were dealing with a home invasion motivated by a desire to inflict terror or harm, which made the perpetrator significantly more dangerous. 2 days into the investigation, a forensic officer made a discovery that elevated the case from terrifying to the stuff of nightmares. While photographing the second-floor hallway, he noticed a faint disturbance in the dust around the hatch to the attic. The hatch was located in the ceiling, just a few feet from the children's bedroom doors. "Get a ladder in here," the officer commanded, his gut twisting with suspicion when they pushed the hatch open and illuminated the cramped, dusty space with halogen lights. The team fell into a stunned silence. The attic wasn't empty. In the corner, nestled between the insulation and the chimney breast, was a makeshift nest that had clearly been occupied recently. There was a sleeping bag rolled out on the insulation, flattened by the weight of a heavy man. Scattered around were empty wrappers of energy bars, several water bottles, and a small, battery-operated fan. But the most chilling detail was the series of small holes that had been drilled into the floorboards. The detectives knelt down to peer through them and recoiled when they realized what they were looking at. One hole looked directly down into the master bedroom, right above the bed. Another looked into the bathroom. The intruder hadn't just broken in on the night of November 14th. The evidence suggested he had been living in the Bennett's attic for days, perhaps even a week, silently watching them sleep, shower, and live their lives, waiting for the perfect moment to descend. The revelation that the monster had been above their heads the entire time shattered whatever fragile sense of security the family had left. Thomas, who survived his injuries with a broken nose, severe concussion, and bruised larynx, refused to ever step foot in the house again. They moved into a hotel immediately, listing the Elm Street property for sale well below market value just to be rid of it. The police cross-referenced the attic evidence with vagrants and known offenders in the area, but the DNA technology of 1990 was not what it is today, and the wrappers yielded no usable prints. The trail was dead. The man in the trench coat had simply evaporated into the Chicago winter, leaving behind a ruined family and a neighborhood paralyzed by fear. Weeks turned into months, and the Bennett case began to go cold. The files sat in a thick stack on Detective Miller's desk, a constant reminder of his failure to catch a predator. The community remained on edge, buying guard dogs and installing expensive alarm systems, but no other attacks of a similar nature occurred. It seemed as though the intruder had satisfied his urge and moved on. Or perhaps he had just drifted away. The Bennetts tried to rebuild their lives in a different suburb, attending therapy and trying to forget the eyes that had watched them from the dark. But just as the city began to forget the horror on Elm Street, a breakthrough came from a completely unexpected source nearly a year later. In the winter of 1991, a property developer bought the old Bennett house with plans to renovate it. During the demolition of a false wall in the basement, an area the police had checked but not destroyed, the construction crew found a small, rusted metal box hidden behind the brickwork. They pried it open, expecting to find money or old documents. Instead, they found a collection of Polaroids and a leather-bound journal. The construction foreman called the police immediately. When Detective Miller arrived and opened the journal, the color drained from his face, The handwriting was jagged and frantic, detailing not just the Bennett stalking, but a list of other addresses, other families, and a manifesto of observation that spanned 3 states. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning to be understood. The contents of the rusted metal box found in the basement provided a terrifying window into the mind of a monster, revealing a depth of depravity that shocked even the most hardened FBI profilers. The leather-bound journal was not merely a diary. It was a meticulous logbook titled The Hosts, detailing the daily lives of 6 different families across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Ohio. The entry for the Bennett family was the most recent, spanning 12 days prior to the attack. The handwriting was jagged but legible, documenting the family's dinner times, their favorite TV shows, and even the specific hours the parents were in deep REM sleep. The father checks the locks at 1015. One entry read, "He thinks the brass will hold me. He doesn't know I'm already inside." Alongside the journal were 3 stacks of Polaroid photographs, each bundle rubber-banded and labeled with an address. The photos were grainy and taken in low light, mostly shot from high angles, looking down through vents, cracks in the ceiling, or from the shadows of open closet doors. There were pictures of Eleanor reading in bed, Thomas shaving in the bathroom, and most chillingly, Jason and Sarah sleeping in their beds. Taken from just a few feet away, the realization that the intruder had been standing over the children while they dreamt, armed and capable of violence, caused a fresh wave of trauma for the family when they were informed. He hadn't just been living in the attic, he had been roaming the rooms freely while they were unconscious, a silent ghost participating in their lives. The discovery of the box allowed detectives to finally link the Bennett case to a string of unsolved phantom break-ins throughout the Midwest in the late 1980s. In several instances, families had reported food going missing, strange noises in the walls, or the feeling of being watched, only to be dismissed by local police as having overactive imaginations. In one tragic case in Ohio, a single mother had been found strangled in her home 2 years prior, a case that had gone cold due to a lack of DNA evidence. The journal contained an entry about her, criticizing her for waking up too early and ruining the game, confirming that the intruder on Elm Street was not just a stalker, but a dormant serial killer who had been escalating his behavior. With this new evidence, the police were able to generate a profile and eventually a suspect. They zeroed in on a man named Elias Vane, a transient carpenter and former pest control worker who had drifted through the tri-state area doing cash-in-hand renovations on historic homes. Vane had a history of petty burglary and a known obsession with Victorian architecture, specifically the crawl spaces and hidden areas of old houses. His employment record showed he had worked on a roof repair for the neighbors of the Bennetts just 3 weeks before the attack, giving him the perfect vantage point to scout their home and likely locate the attic access point from the roof or a loose exterior vent. A massive manhunt was launched for Elias Vane in early 1992. With his face plastered on news stations across the country, tips flooded in, placing him in diners and motels from Detroit to St. Louis. But the man was a ghost, an expert at blending into the background of society. He had no bank accounts, no fixed address, and no close family. The police raided a squat in Milwaukee where he was rumored to be staying, finding only a sleeping bag and a collection of maps marked with the locations of large, historic residential districts. He was always one step ahead, moving with the seasons, likely finding new hosts to support his parasitic lifestyle. Despite the intense scrutiny, Elias Vane was never apprehended, vanishing into the vastness of the American landscape. As for the Bennett family, the trauma of the event and the subsequent revelations proved to be an insurmountable burden for Thomas and Eleanor's marriage. The guilt Thomas felt for not protecting his home, combined with Eleanor's crippling PTSD, created a rift that eventually led to their divorce in 1994. However, they remained united in their love for their children. Thomas moved to a high-rise condo with 24-hour security, refusing to live on a ground floor ever again. Eleanor moved to a ranch-style house in Arizona, a place with no basement, no attic, and wide-open spaces where no one could hide in the dark. They both spent years in therapy, trying to dismantle the fear that had been installed in their minds that winter night. Jason and Sarah, now adults with families of their own, have processed the trauma in different ways. Jason became a security consultant, specializing in home fortification and surveillance, turning his childhood fear into a career dedicated to ensuring no one else has to feel that vulnerability. He admits that he still checks the closets and under the beds in his own home every single night, a ritualistic compulsion he cannot shake. Sarah, on the other hand, struggles with insomnia and refuses to sleep in a room with the door open. The psychological scar of knowing that a stranger was watching her from the ceiling has made the concept of privacy feel like an illusion she can never quite trust again. The house on Elm Street stood empty for 2 years after the box was found, branded with a stigma that no realtor could talk around. Eventually, it was sold to a developer who gutted the interior entirely, removing the attic, the secret spaces, and the history of the walls. Today, it is a modern, open-concept luxury home, unrecognizable from the fortress of shadows it once was. The current owners likely have no idea that in the space where their master bedroom chandelier now hangs, a man once lay on a bed of insulation, peering through a drill hole, deciding whether the family below would live or die based on his twisted whims. This story serves as a terrifying reminder that the boundaries we build, the locked doors, the high fences, the thick walls are only as strong as the unknown vulnerabilities we cannot see. We assume that when we lock our front door, we are alone, sealed off from the dangers of the world. But the Bennett case forces us to ask the uncomfortable question, what if the danger isn't trying to get in? What if the danger is already inside, waiting quietly in the crawl space, listening to you breathe? It suggests that sometimes the creak of the floorboard isn't just the house settling, but the sound of someone else settling in for the night. Thank you so much for reading this story. If this case gave you chills or made you look up at your own ceiling a little differently, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more dark, mysterious, and true stories. I cover strange disappearances, true crime, and the unexplained every week. Until next time, stay safe, check your locks, and maybe, just for tonight, leave a light on in the hallway.